All right. Hey guys, Mike in the Woods here. Recently, I went on my first successful solo overnighter in cold and snowy winter conditions. I've been on successful winter backpacking trips before, but that's always been with a group. This is the first time that I've done so successfully by myself. And like any trip where I push my comfort zone, I think it's important to do an after action report and take a look at what went right and what went wrong. That way you guys can hopefully learn from my experiences. So a quick reminder to subscribe if you haven't already, and let's take a look. Number 5, 3D printed gear continues to look promising. So recently I've been trying to use as much 3D printed backpacking gear as possible, made right at home on my desktop 3D printer. And one such implementation is my 3D printed tent stakes. In the warmer weather, I was experimenting with more traditional tent stake designs, but now that the colder weather's here, I'm using a sand and snow design. This particular design can either be inserted vertically like a normal stake, or buried sideways, tied off to the center. This trip saw them exposed to -6 degrees Celsius outside temperatures, stuck in the semi-frozen mud and snow overnight, and aggressively manhandled back out of it when I packed up camp. And they actually held up extremely well, suffering only a bit of wear and tear from me brute forcing them out of the ground with my multi-tool, despite only being printed in bog standard ABS. Other 3D printed gear in my kit includes my carabiner, also ABS, for bear hangs and clipping stuff to the outside of my pack, my emergency whistle on my keychain in PLA, and some line tensioners in ABS that I didn't make much use of on this trip after realizing I'd need to rip down my tarp and restring it from scratch to use them properly. Other 3D printed winter gear I plan on experimenting with is a lightweight shovel for clearing snow around my shelter, although I'm worried my design is a bit too small and lightweight. Larger carabiners to replace my steel carabiners and S-hooks for my hammock. In theory, by doubling the size of the carabiner that was able to hold 60 pounds in a prior test, it should be able to handle 480 pounds max at idle load. I'd only be putting 150 pounds on it, load split between two ends of the hammock, but that remains to be seen. And lastly, some ridiculous and impractical but highly entertaining things. Keep an eye out for that in the future. Number 4, it's harder to stealth camp in winter. I mean, there's the obvious, no foliage on most of the trees, unless you're lucky enough to find a patch of all evergreen trees, but even then, there's no accompanying support from grasses, bushes, and any other plants you might be able to break line of sight with. So, most of the time, you're left with only the trunks and branches of trees and the landscape itself to keep you out of sight, and most of the time, it requires you to put more distance between you and prying eyes than you would in, say, summer. On my little winter overnighter here, I was in an overgrown dog park nestled between a conservation area and a residential area, and the geography kind of forces you on the residential side, unless you want to trudge through soggy, deep marsh that hasn't frozen over yet. In the summer, you are more than deep enough to keep visibility to 0 from all angles, but this time of the year, even though I was fairly deep in the dog park, I still had visibility from the houses that border the park. In winter, it obviously gets dark early, which can help cover your presence, but it's a catch-22 because that means you'll have a longer risk period for using your flashlight to see what the heck you're doing. And having your flashlight on is practically a beacon for, hey, I'm right here. Stealth camping also means no campfires, which in winter is a strong component for keeping you warm and cooking, meaning you have to rely on just your layers and sleep system alone to get you through the night. Personally, I may do with just a twig stove, but even then you have to be careful of who or what is downwind, as even just the smell from your little twig stove might be enough to attract attention depending on how easy it is to get to your little hidey hole. I've been binging a lot of Steve Wallace lately, and the one thing I see him doing is using seasonally appropriate camo netting for stealth camps, and I think that is an absolutely brilliant idea. I think I'm going to pick some up for myself for year-round stealth camp situations to help with the line of sight issue. Number 3, wind is the enemy. By now, I'm sure we all know that staying warm in winter is the name of the game. However, I think I had ever so slightly underestimated just how much of a chilling effect even the slightest wind can have. Originally, I had set my tarp up a bit higher for a hammock hang setup, but I wound up sleeping on the ground, more on that in a minute, so the tarp wound up sitting a bit higher than it probably should have for a ground sleep setup, and I was too lazy to adjust the tarp lower to the ground by the time I shifted to a ground sleep setup. There was a foot-high gap between the ground and the edges of the tarp, which meant that the breeze that was buffeting me all night was able to get under my shelter and sap heat from me directly. If you have a breathable sleeping bag, this means that the wind can leach the body-warmed trapped air right from the insulation, have a very chilling effect on you, making you have to fight against well more than just the base temperature. I had a very chilling night with barely any sleep on this trip, and if I had made more of an effort to guard against even the small amount of wind hitting me all night, I think it would have made a world of difference. Number 2, sleep system layering efficiency. My setup for these temperatures, down to an absolute bare bottom minimum of minus 20 degrees Celsius, is a 2-layer system of my Sail Dreamland sleeping bag that I can use comfortably down to minus 1 degree Celsius on its own, and a heavy-duty wool blanket. On this trip, I used my wool blanket on the outside of my sleeping bag, which I think was a really inefficient way of using it. I mean, it was tucked underneath my feet, but other than that, it was just draped loosely around me, so it wasn't particularly great at trapping heat, especially when I rolled around in the middle of the night. I think a far more efficient use of it would be to use it on the inside of my sleeping bag as a heavy-duty liner that would be far more efficient at trapping heat, as well as fill up dead space inside the sleeping bag with more insulation. It would also prevent it from slightly compressing the loft of my sleeping bag by being on top of it. I'll also be experimenting with adding a fleece liner to my kit as well. I'm still trying to nail down my permanent setup for my minus 20°C loadout. The other components that help me get that low is by wearing base layers and my coats. And number 1, the importance of tactical options and backup plans. Murphy's Law loves me. On each one of my trips, something goes inevitably wrong, and on this particular trip, the repair that I had made to my hammock failed. I had needed to replace the rope on one end of the hammock that cinched the gathered end together and connected it to the carabiner, but I, perhaps stupidly, used dollar store rope thinking it would be more than enough to handle my weight. Boy, was I wrong. It survived my initial laydown test, but failed the moment I actually went to go to bed. Thankfully, being aware that this was a possibility, I was prepared with a backup plan of a ground sleeping setup, since I had an extra tarp that I could use as a ground sheet, which doubles as a waterproof outer shell for my main tarp and wool blanket when they're rolled up and strapped to the outside of my pack. And this is also why you test new gear and repair jobs closer to home rather than one day deep into the woods. Don't skip your shakedown trips. So, that's that. 5 lessons that I learned on this trip. Don't get me wrong, although I didn't get much sleep that night, I consider that trip to be a resounding success, and this is more of a reflection of areas of improvement and things that saved my bacon rather than an outright teardown of a crapshoot. If you're new to the channel, I take a look at how fun, futuristic technology can intersect with traditional outdoors experiences. Take a look at my other videos and consider subscribing if that's your thing. If you're interested in those tent stakes I was using, I actually sell those as well as other outdoor 3D prints and paracord gear on my online shop. Check those out if you want to help out the channel and give me an excuse to use my 3D printer. Link in the description. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you next video.